Our speaker tonight. I'm happy to introduce Sarah Sloane. Sarah began teasing apart the details of Bushtits and their social structure and cooperative breeding systems back in about 1986 when she started her undergraduate research at the University of Michigan. Her studies there actually focused on Bushtits in southeast Arizona, as Bushtits don't really care for cold climates. Inspired by the sociality of those Arizonian Bushtits, she migrated part of her research to the Pacific Northwest in 2013, spending a considerable amount of time in Seattle's own Discovery Park. She eventually, though, came to center her work in Portland, Oregon, and has carried on that endeavor ever since. Dr. Sloane says that on a whim, she began writing her engaging and fact-filled blog entitled The Secret Lives of Bushtits. If you want to peruse it, you'll enjoy learning so much. For example, when does the color of the female Bushtit's eye change to yellow? Well, the answer is within a few weeks of leaving the nest. And those are just some of the interesting details you will find out. Dr. Sloane is Associate Professor of Biology at the University of Maine in Farmington. She is author of the encyclopedic chapter on Bushtits in Birds of the World, and without a doubt can be called the world's expert on the species. And with that, Dr. Sloane, I'd like to introduce you and welcome you to our meeting tonight, and we look so forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much. Just need to get this on the screen and we'll get going. Okay. All right. This is a bird that is certainly absolutely a familiar bird to almost every single one of you that's watching this presentation. This is a bushtit, Psaltriparus minimus. It is the only New World representative of its family, the Aegothalidae. Now, bushtits range from southern British Columbia all the way down into Guatemala and as far east as portions of Texas. Everywhere they live, they are non-migratory and resident. So if you see bushtits during the winter, you will also see bushtits during the breeding season and vice versa. Well, let's look at bushtits here. This is the smallest, arguably, I'm going to say in quotes because some people would argue with me, the smallest passerine in the United States, averaging 5.5 grams, which is about half the size of a chickadee, which weighs about 11 to 12 grams. And because it's a Zoom talk, you can't see my hand. You'll just have to take my word for it. I am a very small person with a very small hand, and this is my hand. And this is what a bushtit looks like in the hand. So it is quite small. Okay. All right. Now, bushtits have the rather dubious distinction of being one of 3 birds first described as having what are called helpers at the nest by Alexander Skutch in 1935. Now, a helper at the nest is an individual that directs their parental behaviors, like feeding, at offspring that are not their own kids. Systems that have helpers at the nest are called cooperative breeding systems, and we now know that about 9% of all bird species exhibit some form of cooperative breeding, although it varies considerably from species to species. Now, why is cooperative breeding interesting? Why would a behavioral ecologist like myself be interested in cooperative breeding? It's because it appears to involve an altruism. That is, the birds that are helping are not breeding and therefore are not passing on their own genes. So how does something like that evolve? How do you evolve helping behavior if the behavior is genetic, but it's not getting passed on because you're not having your own kids? It wasn't until 1964 that W.D. Hamilton came up with a very interesting and unique idea to explain this called inclusive fitness. And that's the idea that you pass on genes not only through your own kids, but also through the genes that you share with your close relatives. So if you're helping close relatives, you are actually passing on some of your genes, although not as many as you would be if you were having your own direct descendants. Now, you're passing on your genes through your own kids is called direct selection, because I may be using these terms later. Passing it on through close relatives is called indirect selection. And altogether, people often refer to this as kin selection. Now, once this idea became popular, there was a flood of research on cooperative breeding birds in the 80s and the 90s. It became a very popular thing to study, except in bush tits, and which is really curious because bush tits were one of the first birds described by Scutch in 1935 in Guatemala. The only other two studies, other than my studies, was a study by Adicott in 1938 in California and by Irvin in 1974, well, the early 1970s on flocking in bush tits, also in California. Now, not only were there these few studies, but there was also a lot of confusion in these studies as to how much cooperation bush tits were showing, and also who those extra birds, when they did have them at the nests, um, were. So early on, when Sketch first described these birds, he said that they were extra males in the population. So every single extra bird that he saw feeding at a nest, so he'd have a nest with, say, 5 or 6 birds feeding at it, so that would be the pair plus extra birds. And he thought that they were all extra males in the population because they had dark eye, they had the black mask or the black ear, if you want to call it by the appropriate term, and dark eyes. So he assumed they were males, and he thought that it was possible that these birds were uh, helping at the nest because they needed to be warm at night. So once the nest is built, the bush tits will stay in the nest at night, and it's a nice warm place to stay. Subsequent work by Joe Marshall and Alan Phillips suggested that maybe Scutch was jumping the gun a bit, that some of those birds were actually juveniles from an earlier nest helping at their parents' second nest, because in that population in Guatemala, all of the juveniles have black ears, and until they've been out of the nest for a while, they also have dark eyes. So there's some confusion about whether these were extra males or juveniles. Now, in Adicott's study in California, she did a whole slew of research on all kinds of aspects of bush tits, including nest building behavior. She had a few nests with 3 birds, so that would be the pair and a helper. And the extra bird, she doesn't mention what sex it is, and it doesn't seem to be very common. Now, Steve Irvin's study, he actually only had one failed male, sorry, didn't mean to do that, one failed male breeder in his population. And that bird, when his nest failed, he went over and helped at one nest. So that was the only instance of a helper at a nest of all the nests that he studied. He went so far as to say that he thought, I'm not sure these birds are actually cooperative breeders. Because he felt this was possibly an anomalous behavior, that this bird lost a nest, heard the begging babies nearby, and just because of the hormones that were involved, went ahead and fed those kids, and that maybe it was a mistake. But Steve Irvin also observed some really interesting things that I was quite intrigued by, and that is nest ownership exchanges. That is when you go out one day and birds A and B are building at a nest, and then 3 days later you go out and birds C and D are building at the nest. Now we know that bush tits cannot change color bands, so we know that that's a different pair. And he observed that several times at several nests, sometimes 2 birds, 2 different birds, sometimes only 1 different bird. So it looked to me as though bush tits were an intriguingly complicated bird, and that there were so many questions involved in bush tits. And given that they were one of the first birds described as having helpers at the nest, but still had not really been studied much, it was something that intrigued me. So I decided when I was looking for a dissertation project to study um, bush tits. Started out in the Chiricahua Mountains in 1986, down here in the Cave Creek Canyon Basin, which is a very, very popular place for birding, as I'm sure many of you know, based in at the American Museum of Natural History, Southwestern Research Station. I was there until 2011, And then I decided to move my study, and that's for two reasons. One is the population dramatically declined. Where I had 50 nests before, I only had 4 or 5. So it really, really dropped in population, probably due to some persistent droughts. And the other thing that happened was drug traffic increased across the border and into the Chiricahua Mountains. And some of these pictures are some photographs of uh, the kinds of detritus that I was seeing in the field. And so I didn't really feel safe anymore. So after 25 years of research on bush tits in Arizona, I decided to head north. And I indeed did head to Washington State, where I actually first started a study on Shaw Island at the University of Washington's study area. That did not work out well. The birds were really weird. And if you want to ask me questions about it afterwards, I'd be happy to elaborate. But in the interest of time, I won't do that until somebody asks me about it. And then, since that didn't work out, I went to Discovery Park, and I was at Discovery Park for 2 years. And that was a very nice place to be. But the birds spent an inordinate amount of time out here in the burbs. And so it was a relatively small study area, and I really felt that I needed something more extensive. So, much to my daughter's chagrin, because she was starting college at Reed College, and the last thing she wanted was her mother moving to the city that she was going to call her home, although she changed after a while. Anyway, um, I moved to Portland, Oregon. Now, my study area is in several sort of disjunct but not very far away from each other places. There's the Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge here along the Willamette River. And there's also the adjacent parks, and there's another park down here, Westmoreland Park, and also the Reed College campus. Um, and I want to, at this point, thank very much the Park Service for allowing me to do my research in these parks for all these years, and also Reed College for letting me do my research on the campus. And in particular, Gary Granger, who is the head of security. He's been very instrumental in making the campus available to me, even during the 2 years of COVID that the campus was closed to the public. So I was really thankful. It was closed to students as well. I was really thankful to be allowed to continue my work there. So thank you, Gary. All right. Well, what is the limit of most people's knowledge about bush tits? Um, well, everybody sees them as flocking. You always see flocks of bush tits. If you have a suet feeder, the suet feeder will be covered with bush tits. If you have a bird bath, it will be filled with bush tits. And you'll see bush tits when you're out walking about in these big flocks that are there for a moment and then they disappear en masse. They appear to be fairly friendly, tame, even cheerful little birds. And they build these really, really, really large nests. If you've been fortunate to see one, you'll know what I'm talking about. They're massive compared to a bush tit. This picture actually doesn't do it justice because the female's so far in the foreground. But they're built out of spider web and lichen, which acts as kind of as a fabric. Once they get together, they stick together like Velcro, and then they fill the nests with hundreds and hundreds of feathers. So they're like giant down sleeping bags. The other thing that most people know about bush tits is that you can tell the male from the female by eye color. There is actually a slight variation in plumage as well, but eye color is definitely the way to go. This is a male with a natal dark eye. So that's the same eye color that all of the nestlings have. And this is a female that has developed the cream or yellow colored eye, making them look quite fierce, I think. All right. But it's not until you can identify individuals, you can tell Harry from Harvey by color banding them with unique combination of color bands, that you actually begin to realize that what looks like sort of a cheerful flocking birds that hang out at their nests happily in pairs, that you find out there's a lot more going on in bush tit society. There's an incredible amount of social complexity, which is why I have continued to study them for so many years. I have way more questions than I do answers as time goes on. So this bird right here, I just want to run over this really quickly. We affectionately name them based on their color bands. This bird is T over orange, so a light blue over the orange, and the other side is actually also a T, and then it's over the USGS aluminum band that you legally have to have on the bird to color band. And so this bird is affectionately known as Tots, compared to this bird here with the green over yellow and a yellow over the aluminum, that's Geiks. So they all have silly names, which we think are easier to remember than the banding combinations and more fun. Okay. Well, let's look at the kinds of samples that I have from Portland, Oregon only. This talk is going to be only about the Portland, Oregon bush tits, although I'm going to give some background that is also relevant to Arizona bush tits. Over the course of the years, I did not band in 2016 and 2017. I did research without banded birds. Since then, however, from 2018 to 2024, I've banded 700, sorry, 700, whoops, did it again, 708 birds. We've found 885 physical nests. 44 of those have been used twice, that is, within the same season. There's been a double brood in there. So we've been able to watch or follow 639 total nests. Unfortunately, predation rates are not low in bush tits, averaging around 57% of nests get destroyed by predators, and that varies a lot from place to place. So, for example, in Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge, which is a relatively natural habitat, it's only about 12%, whereas on Reed College campus, it's a really disappointing 80%, and I think that's because there are the eastern gray squirrels as well as a large population of crows. So even though we have 639 total nests to work with, we can't take all 639 nests all the way to fledging, but we still get information from them. Okay, in 2019, we began to add blood sampling for DNA to our banding scheme. Blood is taken, as you can see here, from the brachial vein, just a little tiny, tiny, tiny little bit of blood, anywhere from 5 to 20 micrograms. I mean, these birds are so small, you can't take too much blood. And then these are processed, the DNA is extracted, and then we use this very new technique called double D-RAD. And I'm going to admit right now that to me, this entire process is a big black box. I am a field biologist, and I have all of these other wonderful people doing the DNA, including Ian Connolly, who is pictured here. At the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology, doing the next step after the DNA is extracted, doing the double D-RAD. Ian is finishing their master's thesis, which with Dr. David Westneat at the University of Kentucky. Um, and One of the interesting things that I should mention about double D-RAD is that you actually get more information from this technique than you do from the techniques that you might be familiar with from, CSI or whatever kinds of crime shows you watch, like DNA fingerprinting or microsatellite DNA. We actually end up with relatedness values for birds. So how bird X is related to bird Y. And this is really exciting. It's something that I've been waiting for years to have. All right, what kinds of blood samples do we have now? We've sampled 508 birds, although right now we've only been able to do the double D-RAD through 2023. So that's 405 birds that we're looking at now. We've been able to get nestling blood and the attendance, or some of the attendance at the nest, from 75 total nests so far, although for this talk, I'm only going to be looking at 50 nests through 2023. And I had this highlighted because I wanted to make sure that you understood that although we have all of this blood from these adult birds as well as nestlings, we really have only started to analyze and look at what this blood means. So this talk is very much limited to these 50 nests that we have nestling blood and, as I said, blood from some of the attendants or some of the males and females that are feeding at the nests as well. So This is a tantalizing new information that I'm going to be presenting today, but it is by no means the complete information that we're going to have once we have all of the blood analyzed and we can start to really look at how different birds are related to each other. Okay, so what are some of the important basics that you need to know about bush tits before I go on to the more complicated stuff? This is basics that I've learned from both the Arizona and the Oregon birds. It seemed to be common to both groups. All right. The first thing is bush tits live in flocks. Duh, you all know that. They live in these big flocks of from about 10, anywhere from 10 to 40 adults. Uh, the important thing to know about that is the flocks are have very large home ranges, up to around a kilometer or so. Now that's in Arizona. I really don't know what's going on in Portland because I am working in an urban environment, so I can't follow full flocks the way I could in Arizona, but I'm pretty sure they're doing the same thing. They aren't really territorial. The flocks will run into each other and they sort of chase each other a little bit and then they go their merry way. But the biggest point here is that once you belong to a particular flock, you don't switch flocks. Now, in the breeding season, individuals within each flock will pair up and build nests that they are not territorial around. So these nests are placed within the home range of the territory, and there will be several nests within each home range. Now, the most important thing that you need to know about bush tits, and I think the thing that actually um, is reflected in their complicated behaviors is that flock structures persists year round. So unlike this red-winged blackbird pictured here that lives in a flock during the non-breeding season, and then when the breeding season arises, establishes a territory that he absolutely will not let any other male into, and that territory includes breeding female or two sometimes. But they're very territorial and very aggressive to other males. Bush tits are not like that at all. Bush tits continue to belong to their flock even in the breeding season. And because of that, they are aware of and even visit each other's nests throughout the breeding season. So if you watch a nest, you'll often see other birds coming to the nest other than the breeding pair at the nest. They also hang out with flock members during the nesting season. So if they're not actively building at a nest, they will hang out with their buddies. And if both male and female incubate and take turns incubating, they're very egalitarian in that way. Whoever is not sitting on the eggs will go hang out with some of the flock members. So what this does is it opens the door to a variety of really interesting, complex social interactions. And that's what I want to talk about in this talk. Some of the things that bush tits can do, although I'm not going to let you know yet whether they do or not, we'll get into that in a minute, is possible egg dumping, something that I observed in Arizona, or I thought I was observing in Arizona. Um, that is when a female lays an egg in a neighbor's nest rather than in her nest. Well, she lays eggs in her nest as well, but she leaves one egg in another bird's nest. This is known as intraspecific brood parasitism. So that's a possibility because the birds are visiting each other. The other thing that might happen is there's an opportunity for what we call extra pair copulations or EPCs. That's when an individual mates outside of the pair bond. So in other words, another male will come in and mate with the female in a pair and then take off. That's just an example of an extra pair copulation. And that could happen at nests. So maybe some of these visitors are doing that. Maybe that's why they're visiting. And it can also just happen in flocks when the birds are hanging out in the flocks. There's also the opportunity to compete for existing nests. And if you'll recall, I mentioned that Steve Irvin had seen nest ownership changes. So there's an opportunity for that if you know where all the other nests are. Um, and or to join at a neighboring nest potentially as a helper. Okay. So what I want to do now is look at each one of these as along with some other characteristics that bush tits exhibit and try to combine, start to combine the behavior and the DNA, so that we're getting a much better picture of what bush tits are doing, rather than just looking at the behavior, which is what I've been doing for all these years. All right, so the first thing I'm going to look at is, do females egg dump? Do they occasionally lay their eggs in other females' nests? And the answer is no. We have absolutely no evidence for egg dumping in Oregon, although, as I briefly mentioned, I did have some behavioral evidence at two nests in Arizona. I wasn't doing blood, so I have no idea what was happening. Um, there are two reasons we know that nothing's happening in Oregon. One is we have no observations of bush tits laying eggs in, or apparently laying eggs in, another bird's nest. And the other thing is, of the 50 nests that we actually have blood from the nestlings, every single one was only a single female. So in other words, there was only one female laying the eggs in those nests, 100% of those from the DNA. So that answers the question, at least now, for now, until we get the other 25 nests that we have, that bush tits, at least in Oregon, are not egg dumping. Now, I couldn't avoid including this bizarre picture, because one of the things that I see in bush tits is very aggressive female-female interactions. In fact, when you see two bush tits fighting, although males do chase each other and get aggressive towards each other, these really, really just unbelievably hostile fights seem to always be between two females. Now, Chuck Schussman sent me a video of these two birds fighting. They had been fighting way up in the air, fell to the ground, got knocked out. He thought they were dead, so he went over to them, started to videotape them, and he sent me the videotape. And then finally got this picture off of the tape. And if you can look really closely, I'm hoping you can see my cursor. This female has her foot wrapped around this female's beak. This female has her foot wrapped around the other female's beak, and they have their other legs completely clasped together. So this is a truly vicious fight. And I put it in this particular slide about egg dumping because it occurred to me that there's got to be a reason why these females are so aggressive to each other. And maybe it's possible that they're trying to prevent other females from laying eggs in their nests. That's pure speculation, but a fun picture. I couldn't resist showing it. All right. What other questions can we answer? Well, who are visitors? That is, birds that are coming to a nest, hanging out a bit, and then leaving. And why are they visiting? What do we know about visitor identity? Well, behaviorally, we know that visitors are often birds that hang out together. They are what I would call buddies, sorry. Buddies. It's also possible that they are relatives. We don't know that yet. Keep in mind that we're only looking at the blood from nests during this talk. So there's a lot of adult blood out there that we haven't looked at. And we will be looking at how birds that visit other nests are related to the birds. But we do have some information from the nests that we have. For example, this nest on Reed campus just last year, number 14, had an unbanded male and a banded female. The visitors at her nest, and they visited in a very friendly way, they were never chased away or anything, turned out to be the father of the female, and we know that from the DNA, and also the brother of the female. And the brother visited quite frequently. The father did not visit until the tail end of the feeding cycle. But so it's possible that some of these visitors are indeed relatives. Now, visitations are not always friendly. So here's a good example of that. This is in 2021, nest 18. We had a banded female, Z, and a banded male, Xi, and they were visited by a neighbor, Wux. And we have a really long history on Wux, but I don't have time to get into that. He's a really interesting bird. It turned out that Wux is indeed related to the male at the nest, and related to Xi by 0.33. And I just want to briefly explain what that means. If you are a son or a father or a brother, then your relatedness value is 0.5 or 1/2. Anything less than that means that you're less than a father or brother or whatever. But this 0.33 value makes it very clear that he was at least a related visitor in some complicated way. We don't really know exactly how, but he was related. But what was Wux up to? Wux was extremely aggressive and persistent. So unlike that previous nest that I described, where they all the visitations were quite friendly and nobody chased anybody, this time Wux was extremely aggressive. He chased the male, he chased the female, he did it day after day after day. And it turns out, when we look back, that he was actually doing it during the egg laying period of that nest. And that is when birds mate the most, is during the time that they are actually laying eggs. So the question that I had was, okay, what's he trying to do? Well, maybe he's trying to mate with the female at the nest. Maybe he's trying to mate as an extra pair copulation because it's not his nest. So we looked at the DNA of the nestlings, and the answer to the question is, oh, right, sorry. We're going to look at whether or not they're extra pair copulations and who these birds are. But the answer to the Wux question is not Wux. All of the nestlings at that nest could be attributed to the male at the nest, to Xi. So Wux, even if he was attempting extra pair copulations, he was not successful. Now I'm putting up this really blurred picture here because it's a absolutely fascinating, cool picture. Um, it is a picture of a banded female in a mating posture with a male who is clearly courting her, and he is not banded. And we know that her mate actually was a banded bird. So this is a potential extra pair copulation. And it is the only time in all of these years that I've ever seen an extra pair copulation. And I did not see this. I did not take this picture. This picture was taken by Jonah Rothling, I think that's how it's pronounced, who is a student at Reed who had just gotten a camera for his birthday. And so he was wandering around campus taking pictures and heard this ruckus in the bushes and snapped this picture. And lo and behold, it's the only evidence we have of an extra pair copulation out of all of the 39, almost 39 years that I've been doing research. He was delighted that, I was delighted that he got in touch with me and gave it to me, and he was delighted that it was such an important picture, and I was so excited by it. So we do have some behavioral evidence of extra pair copulations. But more importantly, the DNA has corroborated that 10% of the nests that we sampled, so 10% of those 50 nests, had at least one extra pair paternity kid. So an EPP is a kid that was fathered by somebody outside of the pair bond. So extra pair copulations are indeed taking place. And that's a really exciting thing to learn from the DNA, because I've long suspected that this was happening and have never been able to prove it. So now, yay, I finally have it. I'm really happy about that. Now, in only one case so far, we may be able to do more as we do more with adult blood. We were able to identify the father of that extra pair kid, and it was a neighboring male. And we did that through the DNA. Now, 10% is not insignificant, but it's still low to some others, lower than some other species. For example, bluebirds, where the rate of extra pair copulations is actually about 30%. So bush tits do it, but they don't do it that often. Okay, so let's finally move on to the whole helper situation, because after all, that's how I started this talk. That's how I got interested in bush tits. Are there helpers? Do bush tits have helpers at the nest? And if so, who are they? All right, just as a reminder again, a helper at the nest is an individual that directs parental behaviors at offspring that are not their own. So they go to a nest and they act like a parent, but they're not a parent. Now in Arizona, I had quite a high incidence of helpers at the nest. So I was really happy to get that, because I promised my dissertation committee that I was gonna get it. And given the previous research, I was kind of going out on a limb. 37% of the nests that I had a helper at the nest, and it varied a lot in number. So one nest actually had 6 males feeding at it and 1 female. It was the most difficult nest to watch I have ever watched in my entire life because all of the birds were banded, color banded, and I think I got, as I recall, 128 feedings per hour. So it was a scramble to try to write down who was feeding. It was really crazy. But usually, extra birds in Arizona were a single male, although I did have, by the way, one nest in Arizona where juveniles from a previous nest came back and helped their mother raise the kids after the father disappeared. So I did have that happen once. Now in Portland, I have a much lower incidence of helpers at the nest. Only about 12% of the nests have at least one extra bird. It varies considerably though from year to year. So last year it was 21%, and that's of the nests that we could watch through to fledging because a lot of helpers join later in the season, so later in the feeding cycle. So that seems high, but it is high, but it represents only the nest that we could actually watch enough. Um, Usually it's only a single male, and I was going to end it at that, but I realized that last year we had a nest where there were 3 males feeding. So it'll be very interesting to look at the blood. We don't have the 2024 blood analyzed yet, so we will be getting that information soon. I'm not sure I mentioned that we have the 2023 has gone through the double DRAD process. The 2024 blood is going to be going through the double DRAD process at the end of this month. And then it'll take a while for Ian, I hope, to put it in through the various computer things that have to happen in order for us to get relatedness. So hopefully looking at having that information perhaps by the end of the summer. So yes, Bushtits are cooperative breeders in both Arizona and in Portland. All right, but who are helpers? Um, Using both bands and DNA, we can make some conclusions based on that. Again, just a few nests at this point. We'll be getting more nests. One is this really gruesome nest, which I don't know. I decided to show you this picture because it's just so weird. This was a nest last year on Reed campus that was way up in a tree, so we could not get to this nest. This picture was taken by one of my students through, actually, I think he took it through, no, he had a big lens on his camera, right? And we call it cadaver nest because at the mouth of the nest here is the body of a dead bush tit. And when we found it, that bird was already there. It was an unbanded bird, but we never could tell whether it was a male or a female. But what we did know is that there were 2 males feeding at the nest, and one of them was the son helping his dad from the previous year. So he hatched the previous year and he was helping his dad. And this was after he had been unsuccessful himself at several nests. Now, he was not helping his mom, so he was only helping his dad. So he was helping probably half siblings. Because that nest was so high, we couldn't get the nestlings to do blood or color banding, so we were missing that. But because the adults were banded, we could at least tell that it was a son helping his dad and probably therefore helping his half siblings, which, as I hope you remember, means that he was getting indirect benefits by helping them. In other words, he's passing on some of his genes by helping his relatives, by helping his half siblings and his father. So if he were helping total strangers, he would not be passing on as many of the genes as he is when he's helping a relative. Okay, so what did the DNA, that's something that we could use DNA and behavior to determine. What about just DNA? So there are some nests where we didn't actually know where the birds came from, but we could from the DNA tell that at nest 31, the helper was actually a full sib to the kids in the nest. In other words, he was helping both of his parents. And then at Nest 29, also on Reed campus, this was both in 2023, a helper was helping his half-sibs. So he was the son of just the male with a different female. And we know that from the DNA analyses. Now, there are many others that we suspect may be related, but once we include the 2024 DNA, because we're going to have half again as many nests, 25 more nests to look at, we'll be able to determine whether we're getting more of this. But I do think that at least at this point, with the little bit that we've done, that it looks like, yes, it's possible that kin selection has been important in the evolution of cooperation in bush tits. That's a pretty broad statement. I probably shouldn't say it, but I did. Okay. But are all these birds helping relatives? Let's look at a story. And I love to tell stories about bush tits. I think it's fun, and it also illustrates some of the more complicated things that are going on with bush tits that you can't tell if you're just asking questions. Now, the beautiful thing about this story is that it also introduces some really interesting things that are going on. So this is a story of nest number one, and yes, it really was nest number one in Oaks Bottom in 2019. But to explain what was going on there, I need to start with 2018 and the two birds that were at a nest there. Giggles, a male, and Pixper had a nest hanging out, I mean, like ripe fruit. I never understood why a predator didn't get it. And they had two successful broods in that nest in 2018. In 2019, we went back to the same place. The nest was gone. It had fallen out of the tree, which happens frequently. But there was an unbanded male and Pixper, the female from the previous year, hanging out together right around where the nest had been. And I thought, oh, that's a shame. I guess something happened to Giggles, and maybe we won't see him again. That's too bad. But a few days later, we went, and Pixper wasn't anywhere to be seen. Instead, Giggles and an unbanded female were hanging out right where the nest had been. And so this was an interesting puzzle. A few days later, wondering, of course, who's going to start building a nest there, we had an unbanded male and an unbanded female building a nest in the exact same spot that the 2018 nest had been. And this is a very common occurrence, by the way. We don't know, of course, if this unbanded female and unbanded male were the same birds that were seen with Pixper and then with Giggles, because we don't have their DNA. But still, they were building the nest. So we thought that was that. Little bit of a disappointment. Oh dear, we're going to have to ban those birds, until about a week later, the nest was taken over by Giggles and Pixper. So now we have Giggles and Pixper building the nest exactly where they had the previous nest in 2018. But unfortunately, that story did not end well. What happened was, during incubation, Pixper apparently died. She disappeared, and she was seen with one of her legs glued to her chest by a sticky substance. This is something that I had seen a few times in unbanded birds before, and in fact eventually found an unbanded bird that had died that way. So we eventually found out what it was. If you want more information about that, I'd be happy to share that with you. So Pixper apparently died. She disappeared. Foraging with one leg is very difficult for a bush tit. Giggles, sort of gamely, tried to incubate for a while, but then abandoned the nest after about a week. So we thought the nest was permanently abandoned for the season, rather sadly, until a few weeks later, an unbanded male and an unbanded female, quote, returned. That's because we don't know if it's the same birds. Refurbished the nest, laid eggs, and hatched a brood. And lo and behold, Giggles returned to the nest and began to help as a non-breeding helper. So he began to feed at the nest as a helper, or so we thought. And remember, this is from 2019. We didn't get the DNA sorted out until 2023. Now that we have the DNA, we know that Giggles was actually not a non-breeding helper. He was instead a father of 4 of the 7 nestlings that were in that nest. So he was taking care of his own kids along with the kids of the other male. The other three were from the same dad. And by the way, Giggles, the DNA shows that Giggles was not related to either male or female at the nest, and all the nestlings had the same mother, which means that this is not really a helper at the nest. This is really a polyandrous trio. So this is two males and a female contributing genetically to the nest and feeding their kids along with the kids of the other males as well. So it's a polyandrous trio. And that was also something I had suspected was happening in Arizona, but never had the opportunity to prove. So this was really an exciting thing to get. What are there evidence of other polyandrous trios in Oregon? Well, we have two kinds of evidence. It's a little thin right now, but we're hoping that with the analysis of 2024 and the rest of the adults, we'll have more information. These evidence are DNA and behavioral. A good example of this is in 2021, nest SL19, which is down in Oaks Bottom. The helper male looks, both parents unfortunately were unbanded, was the father, the genetic father of two of the kids. Now, we only managed to catch two out of the five kids. That's another story. That's another crazy story. But we did get two, and he was the father of two. We don't know who was the father of the other three, but we suspect based on behavior that this was a polyandrous trio. Both of those kids, by the way, also had the same mother. What other evidence of possible polyandry do we have? In 2021, in Westmoreland Park, we had a nest with two males, Bazoo, an unbanded male and an unbanded female, building and incubating together. All three of them built and incubated this nest. So we were very excited about that nest. We felt for certain that both males had mated with the female, but unfortunately, that dramatic heat dome in 2021, I think you all remember it, that it got up to 218 degrees in the shade for 3 days in Portland, Oregon. That heat dome killed all of the offspring in that nest, and unfortunately, that we could not get enough DNA from the bodies to figure out whether or not he was the father at the nest, if both of the males were the father at the nest. But behaviorally, we do believe it was a polyandrous nest. Um, there are also other nests that where you see behavior that suggests that polyandry might be going on. So you often see, not often, but sometimes see an extra male join at a nest, but instead of becoming a feeder, that is, instead of feeding the kids at the nest, he just follows the female around without feeding. So she goes to the nest, feeds the kids, and he follows along, trails after her without any food, and then they leave together. I believe this is mate guarding behavior. And I believe that if they have a second nest, and in a couple of cases they have had a second nest, that he will father the kids along with the original resident male, making it a polyandrous trio. Um, During the time, by the way, that this is happening, usually the resident male, the original male at the nest, is feeding on his own. So he's not hanging out with that pair. He's hanging out on his own. So I think that that third male, that second male, is aggressively keeping the original male from coming to the nest. But eventually, he sometimes does start to feed, and at that point, you can't tell the behavioral differences between the two males. We don't have DNA from these nests yet, but I expect to have it soon. All right. Now we get into the sort of the nitty gritty of the real weirdness of bush tits. I'm going to tell you a really weird story now. Asking the question, this is a little bit of a hint of what this story is going to take you. Are there other routes that males take to gain extra offspring besides extra pair copulations and besides joining the nest as a second male, mating with the same female in a polyandrous trio? To do that, I'm going to tell the story of Rex Rug. And this bird, you can see just two of his bands, R over G. Rex Rug was a bird with a long history. Very, very interesting bird. His territory, well, his home range, he's not territorial. So his area was this upper part of the Oaks Bottom Wildlife Refuge. Now, in 2018, Rexrug was banded at a three-bird nest. That is, there were two males and one female. We banded them very close to fledging. We banded all three birds, and Rexrug was one of those birds. We did not get a blood that year because it was 2018. And then after that nest fledged, we found Rexrug without those other two birds. Those other two birds had another nest elsewhere later in the season, feeding at this nest here, which was about, oh, maybe 200 meters away from the original nest that he was banded at. And this was the one nest where we had an unbanded female join after feeding. So even though visitors are usually males, we did have this one situation where there was a female joining. So he was found feeding. So that's what he was doing in 2018. In 2019, things got really, really interesting. The first nest that he established and built was with a banded female, Erks, and it was here. And simultaneously, there was another nest about, oh, I'd say 200 meters away from it, that was being built, nest number two, that was being built by a banded male, XR, and an unbanded female. I'm sorry. Okay. What happened after the eggs were laid here at nest number one was Rexrug abandoned the female and the nest, leaving the poor female to incubate alone. Remember that I said both males and females take turns incubating. Well, in this situation, she had to incubate on her own. He left and he went and he kicked out XR and maybe the unbanded female. We don't know because she was unbanded, but he took over at nest two. He refurbished that nest with that female, and he stayed there until the eggs at nest one hatched. And then he abandoned the female at two to her own devices. She by then was incubating eggs and went to feed at nest one. And then he stayed at nest one for the rest of the season. They fledged that one brood and then they fledged another brood. So he was a dutiful dad for the rest of the breeding season. But in the meantime, the female at two, who had now been banded, Willix, WLLX, was left to incubate by herself. So she was abandoned. Now, in the meantime, we had a really weird surprise. This has never happened before or since. We found a nest that was only, this is a little bit of an aside, but still interesting. A nest that was maybe 50 feet from nest two. It was completed and it was being fed by four birds, one of whom was XR, the male who had been booted out of nest two. The nestlings were extremely loud and sounded like they were very, very close to fledging, which concerned me because I was thinking, how did we not find this nest? I mean, it wasn't even hidden. It was a really easy nest to find, and the nestlings were incredibly loud. And with four birds feeding, you'd think that we would have found the nest, but I think we were just, you just don't find bushtit nests that close to each other, so I think we just didn't have our eyes open. But not only were there loud nestlings at the nest, but they were also carrying out tiny fecal sacs. Now, you may or may not know that bush tits and other birds produce fecal sacs. The nestlings produce fecal sacs that can easily be transported by the adults out of the nest so the nest stays clean and then dropped at a distance from the nest. Once they get close to fledging, though, they stop producing fecal sacs and they just make a mess of the nest. So I was really confused because it sounded like there were a bunch of kids in there that were ready to fledge, but there were also tiny fecal sacs. So I watched that nest every single day, thinking to myself, should I or shouldn't I put a bag over the nest, which we do sometimes later in the season, bop the nest a few times and see if these guys are ready to fledge. They'll fledge into the bag and then we can band them. I didn't do it because I thought, wow, they're still carrying out these little tiny fecal sacs. And then, unfortunately, the nest fledged before I could make up my mind. And the unbanded male and the unbanded female joined those fledglings out in the field to feed those kids. And I thought, oh, I missed it. I can't believe it. I missed that nest. Why? Why didn't I try to bandit the nest? And then, to my surprise, XR and the female at the nest who is now banded, Gixpuff, continued to feed at that nest, and it turns out there were still very, very, very young nestlings in the nest. So that nest had two broods in it simultaneously of very, very different ages. One that fledged and one that was very, very small, small enough to produce very small fecal sacs. So this was a really interesting surprise. In the meantime, nest two hatched. So remember the lone female was incubating by herself. Well, she gamely tried to feed these kids by herself. It's very, very difficult for a lone bird to feed the nestlings. She looked bedraggled. There's no other way to put it. She looked like she hadn't preened in years. She was constantly bringing food. The kids were extremely noisy. It was clearly a very stressful thing for her to be the lone female at this nest. And then, to our surprise, XR began to feed at the nest, and he continued to feed at nest three too. So he fed for like 20 minutes at two and then 20 minutes at three. So he was taking on the duties of feeding at both of those nests. I'm guessing probably because the extremely loud vocalizations of the nestlings at nest two really stimulated him to feed those kids in addition to his own kids. Okay, so that was a little bit of an aside, kind of a cool story because it's so complicated. But the most interesting take-home message from this whole story is that Rex Rug had two nests simultaneously. Remember, he had nest one and then he took over nest two, leaving that second female to take care of things on her own. And as I suspected, once we did the DNA, it turns out that Rexrug was indeed the sole father at both nests. So he did have two simultaneous nests. Now, when I looked back at previous years and behavioral data, I really think this was happening more than I thought it was. It's just not something that occurred to me that was happening. I have 4 or 5 suspected situations, in particular, where I would find a lone female desperately feeding at a nest, and I'd think, oh, poor thing, she's lost her mate. And then later in the season or the following year, her mate would show up. And I'd think, well, where's he been? And now I suspect that these are situations where males have managed to get two nests simultaneously and end up with two for the price of one, basically. And I think this is a possible goal of these aggressive male visitations. So Wux, if you remember Wux, who was very aggressive about his visitations at the nest, but turned out not to be an extra pair male. He did not mate with the female. Is it possible that he was attempting a takeover at that nest? When I looked at what his female was doing during that time, she was indeed incubating by herself. And so the stage was sort of set for him to be able to do that. He was not, however, successful. But I do think that some of these aggressive male visitations, especially if they're female already, if they have a female already incubating, are indeed males trying to get a second nest. All right. So here's a summary, and I'm saying so far, not because I have more to talk about, um, but because we have a lot more blood to look at and examine to overlay onto the behavioral information that we have. Let's just quickly summarize what I've been able to come up with for this talk. Do females egg dump? Certainly not in Oregon. Every single nest that we looked at, there was only one female as a parent at the nest, DNA parent at the nest. But there's a lot of female aggression, and that's a big puzzle. Who are visitors and what are they doing? We have some evidence that relatives are visitors. So some of these visitors that we're seeing are relatives of the birds at the nest. It's also possible that they're friends. In other words, there's some association that they have that has nothing to do with relatedness. That we will be able to tease apart as we start looking at the adult DNA, not just at nest DNA. Are there incidences of extra pair copulations? Absolutely. We found 10% of the nests had at least one extra pair offspring. And in one case, we were able to identify the bird that was the father of that nestling, and it was a neighboring male. Who are helpers? Well, first of all, I'll ask the question, are there helpers? I forgot to put that in here. Yes, there were helpers. It varies a bit from year to year. It's not as high as we were getting in Arizona, but still there are helpers at the nest. And there's evidence for these helpers doing one of two things. Some of them are sons getting indirect benefits by helping their father or their father and their mother raise siblings. So they're getting indirect, they're passing on genes indirectly through those close relatives. But there's also evidence that some of these males are actually mating with the female and getting direct benefits by having kids in the nest themselves, so that what we really have is a polyandrous trio. And finally, what other routes do males take to gain extra matings? I think one of the most exciting things about bush tits that we're learning from all of this is that bush tit males can have two simultaneous nests. And the fact that these males may be trying to do that may explain why we get all of this aggression at some visitations, at some nests, but not all. All right. So what is new and upcoming and continuing? I've mentioned several times that I will be adding the 2024 DNA soon. I'm really excited about that because we had a particularly good year last year and also a lot of really interesting things happening. Um, we will also be looking at, as I've mentioned also before, the adult DNA and looking to see exactly what flock structure looks like. Are these birds related to each other? Birds that are buddies, are they related to each other or are they not related to each other? This will be another interesting thing to look at. And the other thing we want to look at is whether nests that are near each other are nests of close relatives. So these are the kinds of things we'll be able to do when we look at the adult DNA, and that'll be coming up really soon. The other thing that I'll just briefly mention is, and I've already talked about how bush tits tend to nest in the same place from year to year. These are, we call them nesting hotspots, and it's really weird in a way how they do that. I don't think it has anything to do with habitat. There is a particular place in Westmoreland I can think of where every single year we've had a nest, and every single year except for last year, the nest was destroyed by predators. So it's not like this is a great place to to have a nest. It's just, I really think that it's possible that there's some sort of social aspect to nest site fidelity. So that is something that Ian Connolly may be looking at in the future, along with a postdoc uh, whose name skips my mind right now. Oh, gee, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name right now. A postdoc at the University of actually his name's on the next one, so I'll get it then. Have looked at that, are looking at whether it is habitat or whether it is a social thing. And of course, because I'm addicted to bush tits, I'll be continuing my observations, banding, and blood collection for, I hope, at least several more years, to continue to try to understand this extremely complex social system. And I just want to make a quick statement that I think that long-term studies of single species become far less popular than it used to be. And I think that they are absolutely critical to understanding the kind of variation that birds and other animals exist from year to year and from place to place. So I'd love to see this kind of natural history kind of research that's supplemented with, of course, things like DNA to become a little more prominent and popular in the scientific world again. I'd like to give a big thank you to all of the people who have helped on the project so far in Portland, Oregon. This is just the people that have worked with me in Oregon. This includes people who have banded for me, students who have come out from the University of Maine at Farmington, volunteers from the Portland area, and also uh, researchers from the assistants from the Portland area that have worked with me. And in fact, during COVID, I had a really nice group of people. So this is a lot of them, a lot of people who've worked on this project, and I thank them a great deal. Oh, here it is. Matt Mileski is the postdoc who's interested in looking at nest site fidelity. All right. Well, thank you so much. and I look forward to answering some questions.
Dr. Sloane, you seem so awake. I think everyone realizes that she's 3 hours ahead of us, so we we
Yeah, it's
double our study.
11:45 p.m. here right now.
But we have a nice set of questions, and if I may, I'd like to comment first. Thank you, as others are also thinking on pointing out the importance of vertical studies, long-term studies,
Yes.
and how unappealing that seems to some of our.
Well, we would never have known what the effects of the 2021 heat dome was on bush tits without having a long-term study on those birds, because we could compare what happened that during that heat dome to lots of other years. And that study, that little no, that little paper that we published on that is one of the very few papers looking at the effects of that heat dome on wild birds. And it's
We
because it's a long-term study.
we have a nice set of questions. If I may, I think many of us need first, maybe none of the Portland people, but many of us need a little bit of methodology
Oh, yeah. I
for one.
left that out because it would have been way too long a talk.
Hey,
So,
we're all gung ho, but just a little bit of, for example, um, do you capture the fledglings as they're coming out of the nest? You actually go into the nests? No. Yes?
no, it's even weirder than that. So the adults are caught in mist nets.
Yes.
So that's kind of standard. And I
With
actually
playback.
use bush tit playbacks for
Uh-huh.
that because bush tits are interested in bush tits. So it's actually pretty easy to catch them that way. The nestlings are, we get the nestlings out when they're 9 to 12 days of age, and the only way we know how old they are is because they start carrying nesting material, food into the nest. So it's a closed nest. Otherwise, you can't see what's going on in the nest. And I do a little C-section. I actually cut a slit
The nest.
neck of the nest and take out half the kids and then seal it up, just sort of pinch it shut because it's very sticky. It's like Velcro. Pinch it shut while we process half the kids. And since bush tits can't count, the adults at the nest continue to feed the kids that are in the nest while we're doing that. They aren't disturbed by it. It's actually real amazing how little disturbed they are. And then we switch them out. We do the other half of the kids, and then I clip them shut with little itty bitty hair clips that we've spray painted so they don't shine. So they're cryptic. They're the same color as the nest.
Well, when
So
you first started doing that, I'm sure there was a lot of trial and error, but that sounds, of course, very well practiced. Uh,
it,
y-
for me, it was trial and error, but I've got to say, and a shout out. I don't know if Steve Irvin is watching this talk or not, but he was really so encouraging when I started my research, and he's the one who told me how to get the babies out of the nest. So that was not something I invented. It was something that he was already doing.
there's at least two of us who would like to know just a tiny bit about that sticky substance that's.
Okay, all right. Well, at least on my study area, it turns out that it was the Department of Agriculture was sampling invasive insects. And the way that they were sampling them was by putting out sticky insect traps. And the entrance to the sticky insect trap was quite small, but a bush tit is really small. So it was big enough for a bush tit to get into. And so I'm pretty sure that's where they were getting it. Some of their other traps actually were quite big and very open, and any bird that was an insectivore might think, oh, good, insects, and go in there. So to their credit, as soon as I called them and asked them, told them what I thought was happening, they immediately pulled all of those out of Oak's Bottom and replace them with a different kind of trap that wouldn't affect the birds. So they were very, I mean, literally the next day they did that. So they did do that, but they unfortunately still use those sticky traps in other places. And I also think that people who use tanglefoot and other kinds of things, like to keep ants out of their plants, that kind
Mm.
of thing. Small birds get trapped in that and they can't get it off, and they're going to. And the bird that I found dead, I took into the Audubon bird rescue place, and they looked at it and they said, yes, this is a sticky substance that may have come from an insect trap, and the bird otherwise was perfectly healthy. So,
Very sad.
yeah.
All right, two bush tit nest questions. One individual says they've only seen bush tit nests at eye level. I think this is going to be sampling error.
Oh, yeah.
It's a
Oh,
typical height
no,
for
oh, no,
nests.
no, 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 no.
What was the highest one
Uh,
you ever had?
Bush tits are not aptly named. Bush tit nests are everywhere. Bush tit nests can be in a bramble just at like at head height or lower, or they can be up at the top of a 100-foot tree.
Mhm.
I've found them. We have in Arizona. Oh my God! I mean, some of the trees that we've had to go up to get to the nest are just amazing. I have to use climbing, ropes and everything to do the climbing to get to the nest, and also in Oregon too. In fact, the cadaver nest that I talked about, that was not a nest we could reach. It
Mhm.
was way too high up in the tree. So, it was really frustrating because I wanted to get the nestlings from that nest and see who was the father, to see if perhaps that son actually fathered some of the kids, but we never did get the kids.
Here's one that's quite practical, and I think you've answered in part. Will bush tits reuse a nest if they do not disintegrate during the winter?
Um, I have found some nests at the end of the year that look like somebody could easily use them.
Yeah.
They usually don't, but I have had several situations here in Oregon where the birds have attached a new nest to an old nest and even used the old entrance. And then they'll stretch down a new pocket and it'll look like a double nest. Um, and in some of those cases, eventually the old nest sloughs off over time, and you're left with just the new nest. So they definitely use the same place, and they use the same nest as substrate. But I have in all the years that I've been studying them, I've only seen one nest reused, and it
Mhm.
was by a young pair that had in Arizona that had tried very hard to join at or take over other nests. They were seen at other nests over and over again, and they finally found this empty nest and refurbished it and used it. But that's really the only time I've ever seen it.
If a bush tit survives its first year, what's the average survival? I think your chapter, by the way, folks, birds of the world, wow. The writing is, of course, solid, and it's digestible. But I think you had 8 years and 5 months is the longest known. Is that
Yeah,
what you carry on?
that's right. In my studies, I would say that most bush tits don't live more than 2 or 3 years. But Rex rug, some birds live about 6 years. I have a male. We found a male this last year that we thought was dead and gone. We hadn't seen him for 2 years, and there he was. He was at two nests. In fact, he was bopping around between two nests, very hale and hearty, and he was at least 6 years old. So we do have some birds live to six. And I personally have never had a bird live longer than 6 years. So it's from the literature that we know that sometimes they live up to 8 years.
Perhaps captivity.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I don't know. I think in captivity, you probably get
should
them
be
to live
longer, huh?
even longer. Yeah.
Do you have a city or area in Oregon called Aloha?
Not that I know
Don't
of. I mean,
answer
I
that.
don't know.
A gentleman, a participant named Kevin says, "Where do I send banding info if I can retrieve it from local photos in Aloha?"
You mean color banded birds
I'm
in
guessing,
Aloha?
Kevin, if you want to unmute and tell us what you meant there, you're welcome to. And while you're reaching for that button, um, is the helping, or the helpers, is that the apparent altruism that you referred to in
Yes.
the first slide? Yeah.
Yes,
Do you
yeah.
think
I mean,
it ev-
that's why people got interested in it, because it seemed to be counter to Darwin's theory of evolution via natural selection. Because if you don't breed and leave kids to the next generation, then how are you going to evolve helping behavior if
the
helping prevents you from doing that?
The follow-on question is, did that evolve from cooperative breeding? I'm not sure I know what that means. helping?
Oh, no, that is the definition of cooperative
Ah,
breeding.
good.
Yeah.
Uh,
The definition of cooperative breeding is helpers at the nest.
Yes,
So,
Dr. Sloan,
yes.
this is Kevin.
Hi,
Kevin,
Kevin.
I also saw your show over at the East Cascades Bird Conservancy meeting in Bend last year or the year before. But my question, I have two or three. Where do I send banding information if I can find it on the birds that I have in my yard?
So color bands,
Yes,
where are you?
in Aloha, Oregon, which is west of Beaverton.
Oh, cool. Oh my God, that is so cool. I
I'm
am
gonna
the
put your
only,
email. May
yeah,
put your
I
email?
want you to contact me. Can you
I-
send me your contact information?
Is it okay for me to put your email in the chat, Sarah?
Yeah, sure.
It's
Yeah.
there. It just
It's
appeared.
Yeah, it's just
That
Sloane at
works fine.
Maine.edu. Because that would be the farthest away that we've ever encountered color banded birds, and I am the only one color banding bush tits. So they are
Wow.
absolutely for sure birds that I've banded, and I would be really excited to know who they are.
Okay, that sounds great because I've been studying pinion jays in Central Oregon, and I was told early on that they do not travel more than 4 or 5 miles. And I proved that the first time that we actually banded birds in 3 or 4 locations in Central Oregon. But a question, you showed a pouch that looked like it was human made of two possible nests, looked like attached socks. And I was wondering, do you ever try manufacturing nests?
No, I never
Okay.
have. I don't think bush tits would take to that, although there's a recent paper that I reviewed, and I think it ended up being published, of bush tits starting to build a nest near a hole in a tree, and they ended up extending the nest into the hole in the tree. So it's sort of an opportunistic thing. So I suppose that if one were to hang an artificial beginnings of a nest or a hole of some sort or sock of some sort in an area that bush tits were, you might get bush tits thinking
Yeah,
that it'd be
you
cool to
showed,
build a nest
yeah,
there.
you
But
showed that in one of your slides.
I'm trying to remember what slide you're talking about.
We can talk about that later.
Sure. But I can't, I don't know what slide you're talking about because all of the nest slides that I showed were just single nests.
There was one that gave the impression that there was two lobes to it, but that made it. Let's find another area here.
There is a
look,
nest with two lobes, but I didn't think I had a picture of it in the talk.
Sarah, what is the largest territory you found for a pair of bush tits?
Well, remember, bush tits are not territorial.
Ah,
So that is a question I can't answer. I can
well,
tell you that I can look at home ranges. Territories are defined by defense. Home ranges are defined by use.
oh,
So, that's a very, very hard question to answer in Portland because it's an urban area. So it's not uncommon for me to be following, birds along through Oaks Bottom and then they're in somebody's backyard and I can't follow them. So I don't have the kind of information that I got in the Chiricahua Mountains when I was working in the Coronado National Forest, where I could follow birds until I could follow all the birds. And so those flocks had home ranges of about 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. They were very large. Those are the flock's home range.
Mm.
Within that flock, you'd have to say that each one of those birds had a home range that was that large because they not only stayed around their own nests, but they also visited other birds' nests. During the breeding season, of course, they concentrate more of their foraging closer to their nests, and that is an interesting question, how far they go, but very difficult question to answer.
Thank you.
Sure.
I've just injected a Starbucks card into your computer. You're still going, still going strong.
I'm wide awake now. I'll never go to sleep. It's almost
Um,
midnight, and I'm like,
could you please tell us a little about what was going on Shaw Island?
Oh yeah, it was hilarious. Okay. So a little bit of background. 25 years, how many years have I been studying bush tits? Okay, when my daughter, 30 years ago, when my daughter was a baby, I had this idea that maybe I wanted to study bush tits in the Northwest because I'm a redhead and studying birds in the Arizona sun was not something I was really all that happy about. So I went to the San Juan Islands, thinking, well, that would be a cool place to do research. And it turns out that bush tits actually did not go to the San Juan Islands at all until around 1935 or 38. Can't remember the exact date, but they were not on Shaw Island at all. They were on San Juan Island or whatever the big island is called, where Friday Harbor is, and on Lopez and Orca, but they were not on Shaw Island, which is smaller and has a research station, because I was interested in staying at a research station. But fast forward, when I was no longer doing the Arizona research, I thought, well, I'll go back to Shaw Island because the birders had now found bush tits on Shaw Island. So I thought, I'll go do it. So I went, and I honestly believe that there is one single flock on Shaw Island, and they do not behave like bush tits. My daughter was my field assistant at that time, and we would sit in one place for 6 hours watching the single flock. One place. We get bored, and it's like, well, you want to take a break? You go have lunch, and I'll stick with the birds. Normally, if you follow bush tits, they're all over the place. If you follow a flock of bush tits, they're moving, 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 moving. They're relatively easy to follow because they don't move too fast, and they're pretty tame. But these guys would just stay in exactly the same spot for an entire 6 hours. And then the next day, they'd still be in the same place. And then the next day, we couldn't find them anywhere. So I really think there was just one flock. And I was getting very frustrated. So my daughter was the one who said, Mommy, let's go to Discovery Park. I know there are bush tits there. And so I was like, oh, all right. And then we went, and it was lovely. There were a lot of bush tits.
Oh, wonderful story. Can I ask you a silly one? In your
Sure.
blog. Oh, by the way, folks, if you have not clicked on the chat link to her blog, you can still find it. Just put The Secret Life of Bush Tits. But in that blog, I noticed some years ago you had a little, not a contest, but what's the collective noun for bush tits? Did you ever
Oh, right.
decide?
Yeah. That was so much fun because I got so much response to that. There were so many creative names for a flock of bush tits, and I promised that I was going to choose one. I was going to have everybody vote, but there were so many different ones that not one stood out, and
That's
so
fine.
I kind of abandoned the idea. I'm also a terrible blogger. Every year I think, oh, I'm going to blog. Everybody's going to be interested in all the things that are happening in Bushtits. And then I get so immersed in the field work that, I get home and I'm too tired to blog. So,
I think
yeah.
that makes perfect sense. I mean, your concentration, but when you sit down at your keyboard, it just flows out of you, and it's so compatible with thinking.
Oh, thank you.
Um,
That's
okay,
nice to
please,
hear.
would you please tell the goldfinch story?
Oh, the attack of the killer goldfinches? Yeah, that one year, goldfinches are always a problem because goldfinches do use spiderweb and lichen in their nests. And so they find bush tit nests a wonderful source of spiderweb and lichen. But it was one year in particular, it seemed that every single nest was getting destroyed by goldfinches. And you could tell that the goldfinches had been after them because they were all fluffy and just they didn't look, well formed, and several of those nests were completely destroyed or destroyed enough so that the bush tits abandoned them. And it just seemed to happen time after time after time again. And that's why I called it the attack of the killer goldfinches, because I was just so frustrated. We'd find a nest and then the goldfinches would find it, and that would be the end of the nest. And that happened over and over again. And it was the timing. One weird thing about bush tits, and this may be true of other birds as well, is egg laying dates can vary by as much as 3 to 4 weeks. So in one year, like last year, they nested early enough so that many of the birds, not many, but a lot of the birds had second broods in the same nest. They had time for it. The year before, the first eggs were so late that there was no time for second nests, and so there were no second nests. And so I think that the timing changes is different from year to year. And that particular year, the year of the killer goldfinches, it must have been right when the goldfinches were breeding at the same time. Not smart.
Interesting. Here's a wonderful question. Were you originally planning on starting such a long-term study while you were in grad school? If not, at what point did you switch to thinking about this as a long-term
I
study?
don't think I ever actually made a conscious decision. It was like, God, Bushtits are every year. I like to say that every single year that I've been in the field with Bushtits, they do something I have never seen before. So that just continually happened, and I kept the questions about Bushtits just started to mushroom, and I just couldn't stop studying them because, as I said, I think I have more questions now than I did when I started 39 years ago. So no, there was never a conscious decision to stick with Bushtits. I just became addicted.
Wonderful. Well, your body of work is a combination now of population studies with even DNA and so on, and these individual stories. And one of the ones I love is the one I think it's in, must be Arizona. It was a Mexican jay,
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah.
And when you tell the story, and could you tell if you've not seen that anywhere else? You must have seen lots of corvid attacks. Please.
Uh, well, that's a good question. I haven't actually seen a lot of corvid attacks. That the one I think you're talking about, I haven't looked at my blog recently, but I think you're talking about the one where I arrived and they actually had egg on their face.
Oh, sorry. Well, I wasn't remembering. I was thinking about the one in which the father, the male, came.
Oh, right. Led the J away. That was amazing. That was absolutely amazing. I was certain that nest was dead because there was a J that was within inches of the nest. And suddenly the male of the bush-tit male, rather than mobbing the J, started to make begging nestling calls and moved away from the nest. And the jay turned and looked at him and then followed the male away. And I thought that it wasn't that close to fledging. It was still at least a week away from fledging. I thought, oh, that jay will be back tomorrow and that nest is toast. But they fledged successfully.
It's a great story. Great story.
Yeah, it was, and I've never seen that again. But that was fascinating, absolutely fascinating, really.
If you have questions, she seems to still have energy. Here's one. Is there a proposed reason for the difference in eye color between males and females?
That I wish I had 2 lifetimes. Because if I did, that is where I would go, because that is a fascinating question. The male has the natal color. In other words, male eye color does not change. Females develop these crazy eye colors, these cream colored, yellow colors, which make them look really, really mean. And so far, I haven't done an exhaustive search yet, but so far I have not found another species of bird where the female has the derived eye color and the male has the natal eye color. There are birds where males get different eye colors, but the females retain the natal eye color. And so maybe if I do an exhaustive search, I will find one. So I think it's a really, really interesting question. I do think that it's possible that it's used in communication, because when you catch a female in the hand, her pupils like open wide. And if you look really closely at that picture that I first showed of the one of the badass female in the ice storm, you'll notice that one of her eyes pupils is bigger than the other, slightly bigger than the other. So I think it's possible it serves a communication function. And I would love to find a graduate student or a faculty member who's interested in following up on that, because it is a really, really interesting question.
3 seconds of silence. I can't believe it. If anyone else has a question, we're having a great time, and should there be none? Sarah Sloane, we cannot thank you enough.
Thank
This has
you.
just been riveting. Thank you for staying up so late to give this talk.
No problem.
We all say that. And all the best in your research. We'll be looking for new entries on the blog. The last one was in 2023.
Uh-oh. Gotta get one. Well, if Kevin sends me the banded bird information, that'll be a blog for sure.
Excellent. What great coming together of minds.
Right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.